Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 117, The People of the North, Part 2. Abe no Hirafu gazed out at the sea, waiting for his opponents to appear. He had traveled with a fleet to the far north, into a land that was unlike anything that most of his men had ever seen. They were far away from the rice fields of their home villages. Up here, the people made their way by hunting and fishing, and the land was much more wild. Besides the people, the land was also home to giant bears, much larger than anything back in the home provinces. Giant beasts with paws the size of a man's head. They were truly incredible, but they were not his target this time. As he watched the waves, he saw his prey emerge. They rowed their ships around the cape, coming out from the defensive position they had previously established. Where Hirafu's men flew banners made of silk, his opponents had created flags made of feathers, which they hoisted high in their boats. They were small in number, but they knew this land and these waters. They were comfortable traveling in the cold and unforgiving seas, and they no doubt had reinforcements. Hirafu may have had the upper hand, but he knew he couldn't get too cocky. It was probably too much to hope for that the size of his fleet alone would cause them to submit. If they could be bought off, then perhaps that was best, but Hirafu knew that was also probably unlikely. This was going to be a fight, and Hirafu and his men were ready for it. Before we jump into the episode proper, a quick thank you to Hakucho for donating to support Sengoku Daimyo over on Ko-fi.com. We always appreciate any support, and there is information at the end of each episode on how to help out if you would like to join them. Last episode, we introduced the Emishi and the Mishihase, and we talked about them and their connections to Yamato and the Japanese state, as well as to the modern Ainu people. We went over a lot of the archaeological findings and talked about how the Jomon period, uninterrupted in northern Honshu and Hokkaido, eventually gave way to the Epi-Jomon and Satsumon cultures, while the Okhotsk Sea culture is observed from around the 5th to 9th centuries, and we talked about how these existed in the lands we know as being connected to the Emishi and the Mishihase people mentioned in the Chronicles. This episode, we are going to rely a lot more on the narrative found in the Nihon Shoki, but I wanted to make sure that we had discussion about the archaeology first, so that people would have a background. So if you haven't already done so, I highly recommend going back and giving part 1 a listen. So let's back up and let's set the scene on the peninsula and the archipelago and see what led up to this moment. Well, in 654, the sovereign of Yamato, Karu, aka Kotoku Tenno, had passed away in his palace of Naniwa. His sister, Takarahime, and other members of the royal family had gathered once more in Naniwa when they caught word of his illness, but their visit was brief. Karu passed away on the first day of the 10th month, and a little over 2 months later he was buried. After that, rather than taking up residence again in Naniwa, the court moved back to the old capital of Asuka, where Takarahime reascended the throne. It was now the year 655, almost a decade since Crown Prince Nakano-Oe had orchestrated the murderous coup that had seen the powerful scions of the Soga family cut down in front of Takarahime and others, causing her to abdicate. And now, well, perhaps Nakano-Oe was comfortable controlling things from behind the scenes, because Takarahime was once again the one in power, or at least the one sitting on the throne. And this is an important distinction because there's a lot that would go on during this reign, according to the Chronicles. On the peninsula at this point, the Tang-Goguryeo War was in full swing, with the Tang dynasty regularly harassing Goguryeo. Goguryeo was at least nominally allied with Baekje, whose ruling family also claimed descent from a shared Buyeo ancestor, and Baekje was, of course, a longtime ally of Yamato. Meanwhile, Shilla had thrown their lot in with the Tang dynasty, though, as alliances went, it was not exactly an alliance of equals, and most alliances came and went as the political winds changed throughout the peninsula. Over time, we'll see some resolution coming to the situation on the peninsula, but overall, one of the biggest trends is that during Takarahime's second reign, Yamato was reaching out to a much wider world than it had in the past. This included connections to the south, to those on the Ryukyu Islands, and possibly beyond. And there were continued efforts to reach out to the Tang Empire with varying degrees of success. Those that did go would sit and learn at the feet of some of the most famous scholars in the world, including the Buddhist priest, scholar, and traveler Xuanzang, someone I cannot wait to get into in a future episode, as he really demonstrates just how connected the world had become in this day in a way that is often hard for us to comprehend. But there is also plenty happening in the archipelago and even just in Asuka. In fact, regardless of what the Chronicles say, there are a lot of ancient monuments and archaeological finds in the Asuka region that aren't directly mentioned in any historical record as far as we can tell, but they can be generally traced to this era, reminders of this period that are literally carved in stone. We still have plenty of questions as to just what was going on, but we're starting to see more and more lasting physical traces. Our first relevant entry in the Nihon Shoki for the topic of this episode comes from the 7th month of 655, the year that Takarahime had taken the throne. We are told that 99 northern Emishi and 99 eastern Emishi were entertained at the court of Naniwa, presumably using the government facilities built during Karu's time. At the same time as that, there were 150 envoys from Baekje who were likewise fated. Caps of honor of 2 grades in each case were bestowed on 9 emishi of Kikafu and 6 emishi of Tsugaru. This is an interesting record, and let's explore it briefly for what it means for Yamato's view of itself and its own authority. First, the Baekje and the emishi are being treated similarly. They both appear to be groups that are from outside Yamato, conducting some kind of diplomacy with the court. That said, it is quite clear from the way that the Chronicles deal with them that Yamato viewed each group as distinctly different. Baekje was Yamato's continental ally, and their primary means through which they could have access to the continent and all that it had to offer. They had helped bring Buddhism to the archipelago and were clearly seen as a civilized country. The Emishi, on the other hand, were Yamato's own barbarians. They were outside, and Yamato clearly saw them as less civilized. In many ways, Yamato viewed the Emishi similar to how the Tang court likely viewed Yamato. After all, just as Tang literature talks about the difference between the quote-unquote civilized center of the empire and the so-called barbaric lands beyond their borders, Yamato could place itself in a similar position simply by placing the Nara Basin at the center, and with the Emishi helping define what was outside. So, in an odd way, this may have been uplifting for Yamato's own self-image. And just as the Tang court enticed border states into their sphere of influence with the promise of imperial titles, the Yamato court similarly was bestowing rank upon the Emishi, making themselves the grantor of prestige and recognition. By being a part of the system, you were rewarded with recognition of your status, something that likely appealed to many. As to the places referenced, Kikafu and Tsugaru, well, Aston isn't certain about Kikafu, but Tsugaru seems quite obvious as the northernmost tip of Honshu in modern Aomori Prefecture, where the islands of Honshu and Hokkaido are separated by none other than the Tsugaru Strait. The fact that the chroniclers differentiated between the eastern and northern Emishi likewise suggests that this was not a monolithic state. Yamato saw a difference between the Emishi in one part of the archipelago versus the other. 3 years later, in the 4th month of 658, Yamato sent one of the largest expeditions against the northeast. Abe no Omi, other entries name him as Abe no Omi no Hirafu, took 180 ships up north on an expedition to the Emishi. We are told that he met with the Emishi in the districts of Aita and Nushiro, believed to be in modern Akita Prefecture. Akita Prefecture is on the western side of Tohoku towards the very northern tip. It's opposite Iwate Prefecture on the east and just below Aomori Prefecture, which at the time was known as Tsugaru. This was on the extreme end of Honshu. Both Aita and Nushiro quickly submitted to the Yamato mission. Still, Abe drew up his ships in order of battle in the Bay of Aita, where an envoy from the Emishi named Omuka came forward and made an oath. He swore that they had no ill intentions. The fact that the Emishi were armed with bows and arrows was not because they were at war, but because up in that area of Tohoku they were all hunters, and so it was their regular tool. They swore to the gods of Aita Bay that they had not raised arms against Yamato, but they were willing to submit to Yamato rule. For his part, Omuka was granted court rank and local governors were established at Nushiro and Tsugaru, likely meaning they recognized local chieftains and made them responsible for representing the others. Finally, they summoned the Emishi of Watari no Shima to the shores of Arima, and a great feast was provided. After that, they all returned home. The term Watari no Shima seems to almost undoubtedly refer to the island of Hokkaido. Watari means to cross, so, for example, crossing the Tsugaru Strait, and so referring to the Emishi of Watari no Shima likely referred to the Emishi on Hokkaido, vice those in the Tohoku region. The entire entry seems a bit suspect. Abe no Hirafu takes an armed party up north and they all just sit down and have tea together. There seems to be a lot of missing context. Of course, from Yamato's perspective, they were the civilized center. Does that mean that any violence they committed was simply swept under the rug of history? Or did they truly meet with such quick submission that only a show of force was necessary? There's one other entry for 658 relative to all of this. It isn't given a specific date, so it is unclear when exactly it occurred, but it may shed some light. That entry states that Abe no Hikira no Omi no Hirafu, warden of the land of Koshi, went on an expedition not against the Emishi, but against the Mishihase, or Sushen. He is said to have brought back from this trip 2 live white bears, or shiguma. So was his expedition really against the Emishi, or was his actual goal to fight the Mishihase, which means he didn't just stop at the end of Honshu, but he likely continued on to Hokkaido, Watari no Shima, and up to at least central Hokkaido, where he would have met with people of the Okhotsk Sea culture, likely the Mishihase of the Chronicle. Or was he sailing against both? This also leads to numerous other theories as to just what was going on. While Yamato was pushing on the Emishi from the south, were these Mishihase likewise encroaching on the Emishi in the north? Were they pushing them south or absorbing them in the farthest north? There seems to have clearly been a difference and some conflict between them, as evidenced by later entries, which we'll cover in a bit. Quickly, though, I do want to touch on the idea that they brought back 2 white bears. Shiguma appears to refer to a white bear, and at its most simplistic understanding, that would seem to refer to a polar bear, but that seems quite a stretch. Today, polar bears largely live in the Arctic regions, out on the permanent sea ice, where they're able to hunt. They're considered an aquatic animal, living mainly in the ocean, though they will come ashore to hunt on occasion. Still, they are mostly adapted to life on the sea ice. While the climate of the 700s was different, I don't know that the sea ice extended that far south. It is possible that polar bears had been captured from much further north and then sold to people further south through the extensive trade networks that ran up through Kamchatka, Siberia, and even across the Aleutian chain, but as far as I can tell, polar bears would not have been living in Hokkaido or even in the Kuril or Sakhalin Islands at that time. It's much more likely that the Shiguma was one of the Hokkaido brown bears. They may have been albino, but more likely it was simply an easy designation to distinguish them from the bears of the rest of the archipelago, the Asian black bear. These Asian black bears are clearly black bears, though their fur can appear lighter in some instances. Meanwhile, although brown bears can be very dark brown, their fur can vary almost to a blonde, and if you look at many photos, you can see how they might be considered white, especially compared to the black bear that was the norm in Yamato. I suspect that this is actually the species that Hirafu brought back, which would be referenced in later entries, where Shiguma furs appear to have been quite plentiful, suggesting it was not just a rare mutation. In addition, I can't help but note the presence of bears here seems to further connect with the modern traditions of the Ainu of Hokkaido. most notably in their reverence for bears, including the traditional Iomante ceremony. There's also evidence of the importance of bears in what we see of the Okhotsk Sea culture. It's hard to tell if there's more from this interaction, but it still raises some questions. But anyway, I digress. While there are still lots of gaps, we can see that the Emishi were being brought into the fold, as it were, while the Mishihase were apparently the threat that Yamato would be fighting. In fact, I can't help but wonder if the threat posed by the Mishihase didn't help encourage the Emishi to ally themselves with Yamato in an attempt to protect themselves. Whatever happened, the relationship with the Emishi from that point on seems to place them as subjects of Yamato. We are told that 3 months later, over 200 Emishi visited the Yamato court, bringing presents for the sovereign. These were not just the Emishi of the far reaches of Tohoku, but seem to have included Emishi from several different regions. We are also told that the entertainment and largesse provided by the court was even greater than any time before, no doubt presenting the carrot in contrast to Abe no Hirafu's stick. One of the carrots handed out was court rank. We're told that 2 Emishi of the enigmatic Kikafu region each received 1 grade of rank, while Saniguma, the senior governor of Nushiro, was granted 2 steps in rank, making him lower Shōotsu in the rank system of the time, and he was given the superintendence of the population register, likely meaning he had a charge similar to the other governors dispatched to take a census and let the court know just how many people were in the region. His junior governor, Ubasa, received the rank of Kembu, the lowest rank in the system. Meanwhile, Mamu, the senior governor of Tsugaru, was granted the upper rank of Daiotsu, and Aohiru, the junior governor of Tsugaru, was granted the rank of lower Shōotsu. At the same time, 2 ranks were handed out on the Miyatsuko of the Tsukisara barrier, and 1 rank was granted to Inazumi O Tomonokimi, Miyatsuko of the Nutari barrier. These barriers, of course, being made to keep out the Emishi. So these last 2 appear to have been members of Yamato rather than Emishi, but still clearly related to the issues of the border and beyond. And so we're given 3 different locations. We are not told the names of the Emishi from Kikafu, but we are given the names of the senior and junior governors, likely local chieftains co-opted in the Yamato polity, of both Nushiro and Tsugaru. Together with the name Omuka, we have some of our earliest attestation to possible Emishi names, though whether these were names, titles, or something else, I really couldn't say. So we have Saniguma, Ubasa, Mamu, and Aohiru. None of these are given with family names, which seems to track with the fact that formal family names appear to have been an innovation of the Kofun culture rather than an indigenous phenomenon. I would also note that I'm not sure if these ranks came with any kind of stipend. After all, much of that region wasn't exactly suited to rice land, so where would the stipend come from? That said, there were certainly more practical gifts that were laid out for them as well. The governors of Nushiro and the governors of Tsugaru were each given 20 cuttlefish flags, likely a banner similar to the koinobori or carp banners in use today, as well as 2 drums, 2 sets of bows and arrows, and 2 suits of armor. This seems to be 1 for the senior and 1 for the junior governor. In addition, Saniguma was commanded to investigate the Emishi population, as well as what Aston translates as the captive population, by which I suspect they mean those living in bondage within the Emishi communities. It is interesting to me that even though the senior governor of Tsugaru was given a higher rank, this last duty was only given to the governor of Nushiro. And there you have it. With all of that, the Emishi were at least nominally subjected to the Yamato court. They were still, however, cultural outsiders. It is quite likely that they spoke even a different language, and given the number of place names in Tohoku that seem to correspond with modern Ainu language, it's quite likely that a language at least related to modern Ainu was spoken in many of the Emishi-controlled areas. A similar pattern to the year 658 took place in the entries for the following year. Once again, Abe no Hirafu went north with 180 ships on what we are told, at least in Aston's translation, was an expedition against the Emishi. He assembled a selection of the Emishi of Akira and Nushiro, totaling 241 people, with 31 of their captives, as well as 112 Emishi of Tsugaru, with 4 of their captives, and 20 Emishi of Ifurisae. Once he had them all at his mercy, he then feasted them and gave them presents. Is this really what an expedition against the Emishi looked like? It almost sounds more like a diplomatic mission. We are told that after feasting and giving the assembled Emishi presents, Abe no Hirafu made an offering to the local gods of a boat and silk of various colors. He then proceeded to a place called Shishiriko, where 2 Emishi from a place called Toyu, named Ikashima and Uhona, came forward and told him that Yamato should create an outpost at Shiribeshi on the west coast of Hokkaido, which would be the seat of local Yamato government. This sounds not entirely dissimilar from the idea of the Dazai in Kyushu. Abe no Hirafu agreed and established a district governor there. Relevant to all this, between the 7th and 8th centuries, we see clusters of pit dwellings in Hokkaido, largely in the areas corresponding to the modern sub-prefectures of Sorachi, Ishikari, and Iburi, with many of them clustered near modern Sapporo and a very small amount near Rumoi, further north along the western coast. Once more, it is another account, not the main narrative of the Nihon Shoki, where we might see what was actually going on. That entry claims that Abe no Hirafu went north to fight with the Mishihase, and on his return, he brought back some 49 captives. So was this what all this was really about? Was he going up there to fight the Emishi, or was he perhaps fighting with the Emishi against the Mishihase? When Abe no Hirafu finally returned, it seems that the provincial governors of Michinoku, pretty much the whole of Tohoku, as well as Koshi, which was also a land known for being home to Emishi, were all granted 2 grades of rank. Their subordinates, the district governors and administrators, each received 1 grade of rank. We are also told that on the 17th day of the 3rd month of 659, that a copy of Mount Meru was constructed on the riverbank east of Amakashi no Oka, and that Emishi of Michinoku and Koshi were both entertained there. Little more is given, and it isn't clear if this is before or after Hirafu's expedition of that year. Mount Meru, read as Shumisen today, is the mountain at the center of the world, at least according to some Buddhist traditions. Building a copy would have been a statement, creating a copy of the mountain and bringing the center of the universe to you. This was probably a feature in a garden, at least that's how it's conceived of during the reign of Kashikiya Hime. The second one may have been made with a pile of stones, and there have even been found some features in Asuka that some think could be remnants of this ancient model of the universe, but, well, they aren't without controversy. In any case, that same year that the Emishi were brought to Asuka to view the Buddhist monument, in 659, well, a mission was then sent to the Tang court. We'll talk about the mission at some other time, but for now I want to focus on the fact that they brought with them an Emishi man and a woman to show to the Tang Emperor. Regrettably, we don't know their names, and we don't know their status in Emishi society. Were these captives, or possibly even enslaved people? Or were these volunteers who had gone willingly with the envoys to see the lands beyond their home? They likely had heard of the Tang Empire from Yamato, and so it wouldn't be so surprising if they decided to go see it for themselves. Where it is of particular interest to us right now is that we have an apparent eyewitness account of the description given to the Tang Emperor about the Emishi by the Yamato envoys. Be aware that the envoys were not necessarily experts in Emishi culture and may not have met any other than their travel companions. But the description, given by none other than Yuki no Hakatoku, who was apparently there at the Tang court when it happened, gives us invaluable insight into how Yamato viewed the Emishi. The entire thing is a bit of a question and answer session as the Tang Emperor, Tang Kaozong, inquired about the Emishi and who they were. In response to his questions, the envoys assured him that Yamato and the Emishi were at peace with each other. They further noted that there were 3 different groups of Emishi. Those farthest from Yamato were the Tsugaru Emishi. Next, slightly closer to Yamato, were the Ara Emishi. Ara in this case means soft and was probably a reference to the fact that those Emishi closer to Yamato were seen as more compliant and or more quote-unquote civilized. Finally, there are the Nigi Emishi living right on the borders. Nigi in this case seems to refer to them being the gentle or even civilized Emishi. I suspect that those living closest to Yamato were also the ones doing things like farming and possibly even building their own burial mounds. They may have even mixed with some of the border communities and may have included Wa communities that were outside of Yamato's influence. After all, it isn't entirely obvious that Emishi referred to any single ethnic identity. In providing further answers to the Emperor's questioning, we are told that the Emishi, at least according to the Yamato envoys, didn't farm, but instead they sustained themselves through hunting and fishing. Furthermore, we are told that they didn't live in houses, but instead they dwelt under trees and in the recesses of the mountains. This one is a little more questionable. After all, we have evidence of pit houses and villages all the way up to Aomori and back to Jomon times. However, it is quite possible that Yamato was often encountering hunting parties, which were very likely using makeshift shelters or using natural features like caves when they were out traveling. Some of this, though, may have been built around the ideas and concepts of how quote-unquote barbaric people lived, focusing on their exceptional, exotic, and sensationalist instances rather than on the more mundane day-to-day details. Finally, the Emperor himself commented on this unusual appearance of the Emishi. We know that the Japanese terms for the Emishi refer to them as hairy barbarians, and if they were anything like modern Ainu, they were likely a good deal more hirsute than their Yamato neighbors. This was no doubt a stereotype, as again, Emishi may have also included some members of the Wa in their numbers, but they also appear to have included groups of people that were quite physically distinct. Some DNA evidence also bears this out, and even today, many people with deep ancestral ties to the Tohoku region demonstrate closer ties to ancient Jomon populations than to the succeeding Yayoi population that came over from the continent with their rice farming techniques. And so that gives us mostly what we know about the Emishi, except that they seem to have left out the Emishi of Watari no Shima, that is, the Emishi of Hokkaido. They would have been living beyond the Tsugaru Emishi unless they were considered similar and thus painted with the same brush. And speaking of Watari no Shima, we have one more entry before we bring things to a close, and that is from the third month of the year 660. Once more, Abe no Omi, who must have been getting his frequent cruiser miles in by this point, or at least we hope he'd been invited to the captain's circle. Anyway, Abe no Omi was sent on yet another expedition, this time with 200 ships, and this time quite specifically against the Mishihase. He made a stop in Michinoku on the way up there, and he brought some of the Emishi on his own boat, possibly as translators and guides. They then continued north until they reached a large river. Aston suggests that it was probably the Ishikari River north of modern Sapporo. There they found 1,000 Emishi of Watari no Shima, all encamped. Upon seeing the Yamato forces, 2 men came out from the camp to let Hirafu and his men know that the Mishihase had arrived in their own fleet, threatening to kill all of them. And so they asked permission to cross the river over to Hirafu and join him and his forces. Specifically, we are told they asked to serve the government, suggesting that they were willing to suborn themselves if Hirafu would assist with driving off the Mishihase. Hirafu had the 2 spokespersons come aboard his ship and then show him where the enemy was concealed. They showed him where, telling him that the Mishihase had some 20 ships. Hirafu sent for the Mishihase to come and face him, but they refused. And so instead, he tried a slightly different tactic. He piled up colored silk cloths, weapons, iron, etc. in sight of the Mishihase, hoping that their curiosity and greed would get the better of them. Sure enough, they drew up in their boats, which were decorated with feathers tied on poles like a flag. Their vessels were powered with oars, often preferred for their maneuverability, and they brought them to the shallows. From there, they sent 2 older men out to inspect the pile. The men came out, and when they saw what was there, they exchanged their clothes for some on the pile and took some of the silk cloth and then returned to their ship. After some time, they came back out, took off the exchanged garments, and laid them down with the silk. With that, they then boarded their ship and departed. Aston suggests that this behavior mimics an aspect of something called an unseen trade, which he claims had been common in the region of Hokkaido until recently. I hadn't found anything specifically about that, but it does make kind of sense, especially if groups are possibly hostile and perhaps don't speak the same language. So does that mean that for all of his military might, Hirafu was basically just buying off the Mishihase? Well, it doesn't really matter because it seems they didn't take it. They left the garments and the silk, which seems to have indicated that they had no deal, and thus the Mishihase departed. Hirafu pursued the Mishihase and tried to get them to come out again, presumably looking for a stand-up fight between his 200 ships and the Mishihase's 20, but instead the Mishihase headed to the island of Hirobe in another part of Watari no Shima. After a while of being holed up, the Mishihase did sue for peace, but by that point, Abe no Hirafu was having none of it. So they took themselves to their palisades, and from there they tried to hold out against Abe no Hirafu's forces. Noto no Omi no Mamukatsu was slain in the fighting. As we can only suspect, others were as well. But over time, the Yamato forces began to wear down the Mishihase. Finally, when it seemed there was no way that the Mishihase could win or escape, the Mishihase took the drastic step of killing their own women and children, perhaps fearing what the Yamato soldiers would do to them if they were caught. And with that, it was pretty much over. There are only a few mentions of the Mishihase or even the Emishi in the rest of the Nihon Shoki. Granted, as we'll eventually see, the people of Yamato were no doubt preoccupied with what was going on to the west, where the Baekje-Tang War would soon be coming to a close. Abe no Hirafu would be called on once more in that famous conflict. But we're going to save that for another day. For now, I think we can end things here, or just about. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there is a theory that many of these expeditions were actually just the same thing, but recorded slightly differently in slightly different ways, with some confusion about the actual dates. Even if that was the case, it doesn't necessarily discount the overall information provided, and that information seems to at least somewhat conform to what we know about the archaeological record, at least as far as I can tell. Granted, this is still the story as told by outsiders. Since the people labeled Emishi, or even those labeled Mishihase, didn't leave us with any records of this time themselves, we don't exactly have their side of things, which is something we should keep in mind. Now, this isn't the last time the Emishi will pop up in Japanese history. Even if they were being granted rank, the Emishi remained a group apart. Succeeding generations of Japanese would settle in the Tohoku region, eventually absorbing or pushing out the Emishi or Ezo, while on Hokkaido, the people we know as the Ainu, who were likely an amalgamation of both Okhotsk Sea people and Epi-Jomon and Satsumon cultures, would eventually become dominant across the island of Hokkaido, or at least until the 19th century. All of that is for much later episodes. For now, we'll continue to stick with our small but active corner of the 7th century. There is still a lot more to explore in this reign. Next episode will be our annual New Year's recap, and then we'll continue on with more from this episode in the following year. Until then, I want to say thank you for listening, and thank you again for all of your support. If you like what we're doing, please tell your friends, and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/Sengoku Daimyo. Or you can find links over at the main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we will have some more discussions on topics from this episode. Also, feel free to reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can also email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. Thank you again also to Ellen for their work editing the podcast. And that's all for now. Thank you, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.